Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
How are we all doing?
Okay.
Hi, thank you. Are you?
Yeah.
I'm doing fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Right, so if you can all hear me okay, wave your right hand. And if you can't hear me at all, wave your left hand. Obviously, I'm joking, I'm joking. Yes, no, I'm fantastic. I've had 2 emails this week. One from Colombia, apparently I've won the lottery. Another one from Russia, apparently I've won $10 million US dollars. All I need to do is just send £3,000 release fee.
And your bank details.
The rest of the money's all mine. Obviously, that's a scam. Right, lovely to see you all. As usual, I'm going to warm you up with 2 quiz questions in a minute, but we're here today for a talk from Marcus Chilton Jones from the RHS on the making of the new RHS garden at Bridgewater. And today's talk has been organised by the Wolverhampton Horticultural Society, so thank you to them. So to warm you up as usual, I've got 2 questions for you, and generally they are gardening and health related. So the first question, if you wanted to plant a rhododendron in the garden, in your ground, would you require any special ground conditions? If so, what? And if not, why not?
Ericaceous.
The answer at the end. But think very carefully. And then the second question, before I ask the question, just wave at the screen if you generally get your 5 a day. Right, keep waving. Now, if you actually know how much is in one portion of your 5 a day, wave at the screen.
Well,
much less. So the question is, for one portion of your fruit and veg, how much should it weigh in grams? There's a big difference between the first set of hands and the second set. Answers at the end. So just to let you know, a reminder, I have put a training date in the diary for anybody who needs help with using Zoom or any other functions. So that is the 31st of March at 7:30. So make sure you made a note of that. It wasn't on the last email, unfortunately, but that's why I've repeated it today. We're planning to have a representatives meeting with representatives from each of your clubs in the next few weeks. So if any of your committee members want to get involved in that, please drop me an email and let me know. I'm a big fan of Gardener's World, but there's also another program called Beech Grove Garden, which some of you probably know about. And it's basically the Scottish version of Gardener's World. That's starting in a few weeks' time, in April time. But they're doing some repeats, which start on Saturday, if anybody's interested. It's a very good program. It's much more down to earth and sort of everyday gardening and much more relatable to the average gardener. And that's on Saturday at BBC2 at 1 p.m. So set your record buttons if you want to do that. And we've said previously that guests are very welcome to join our Zoom meetings. They're totally welcome, which is great. All we would like to say is that at some point, if you do enjoy it, consider joining your local independent garden club and support them. And also, just to help out, what I've done is I've created some little adverts, which I've put on the cloud drive. So I put all the dates of all the meetings on there. I don't know if you can see that, if it's very clear. So all you need to do is you just need to change the name, change the contact details, and then you can just print it off and stick it in your local, shops, windows, because it's a good opportunity now to use these Zoom meetings as a chance to recruit new members into your clubs. So all you need to do is just download it off the cloud drive, change the details, change the email address, change the name of the garden club, and then you can print it off. Now, just a couple of tips from my perspective today. If you've got any out-of-date seeds, because obviously now is the time you'll be sorting through your seed boxes. If you've got things like beetroots or brassicas like broccoli, don't throw them away. Use them as microcress, because they're packed full of nutrients. So, for example, if you've got things like radish seedlings, there's been some studies done to suggest that they are super healthy for you. So in terms of anthocyanins, they are super concentrated. So eating 1 radish cress is the equivalent of eating 60 radishes in terms of its antioxidants. And in terms of the broccoli, there's something in there called sulforaphane. I'm sure I've probably said that wrong, but it's an anti-carcinogenic. So eating 1 of these seedlings is the equivalent of eating 90 broccolis. So yeah, just a couple of health tips there for you. Give that a shot. So don't throw them away, make sure you use them. And also, people have been asking me about the plant identification app that I use, and it's called Google Lens. It's free to download. There are lots of apps out there in the marketplace, some of them which you have to pay for, but Google Lens is really, really quite good. I'm just going to quickly show it to you now. If you go to your Play Store, what you'll need to do is search for Google Lens, download it. If you're on an Apple device, it might say get. When you've downloaded it, you'll see it's there in the top left-hand corner. It's like a box, a rainbow box with a blue dot in it. If you click on that, and then whenever you've got a plant you need to identify, you just point it at it, press the button, and it identifies it for you. Really, really easy. And that app is free. And the reason I use that one instead of any of the others is because it works with everything that you want to use. So if somebody's got a handbag that you like, or any other sort of item, you can actually point it at it, press the button, and it'll find it. So now I can just order it straight off the internet. So it doesn't work just on plants, it works on absolutely everything. So very, very useful if you want to give that a go, and it's free. Right, so I'm now going to introduce Marcus. So for those who don't know, Marcus is the curator at the new RHS Bridgewater garden, which is opening, I think, in May this year. So we're all really looking forward to that. Prior to that, Marcus was the curator at the Dorothy Clive Gardens. He's also worked at Trentham Gardens. He's also, you may not know this, he was also a head gardener at the Gardener's World Garden at Berryfields for the BBC. And he's also worked as a head gardener for the National Trust. So can I ask you all to unmute yourselves, and then can I ask you all please to give Marcus a lovely warm welcome.
That's lovely.
Right, I'm going to mute you all now.
Thank you, Andy.
Right, Marcus, you'll just have to unmute yourself. Have you done that? Brilliant, fantastic.
Yeah, I'm back and hopefully
Excellent.
audible again. So thank you for that lovely introduction, and for running through my CV as well. I'd forgotten half that stuff myself. So yeah, I've been invited to talk to you this evening about Bridgewater, the making of the RHS's fifth and soon to be new garden that will open, as Indy mentioned, in May. It's likely to be around the 18th, 19th, or 20th of May, but it's still that last detail is going to be yet to be hammered down. So we're nearly on the final date, but not quite there yet. The movement in that date is relative to the governmental guidelines of the 17th of May date that we're working towards as well. So we're just trying to push fractionally beyond that, and then there's a little bit of aligning of diaries of various people that needs to be done. So we're nearly there, it's imminent, and I'm going to sort of take you through a little bit of the sort of background to the site, some of the history, because I think to sort of understand Bridgewater, you really need to understand some of the heritage and certainly some of the Victorian Edwardian backgrounds to the creation of the site. And then I'll take you through some of the progress, some of the pain and the tears that we've been through over the last few years, some of the surprises, some of them nice, some of them not quite so nice, and then show you some of the images of the update. Now, I've never worked for an organisation or on a project that has such a wealth of photography. I mean, there are so many images every month, aerial images of the site. It goes up on an internal website that we have called Iris, and we can go through that and we can find huge amounts of material. So I'm almost at a loss going through this library of images of what to use. So unfortunately what tends to happen is I possibly put too many up on each picture, so you'll have lots of collages and montages of lots of pictures thrown together. So I hope that they come across on your screens, and I hope anyone's not using really tiny little screens, because you may struggle with some of these collages that I've put together. So I'll start sharing screen now. Hopefully this will work. And that's the one I'm after. Slideshow from beginning. Let's click on that. Indy.
Yep.
How am I doing? We're seeing
perfect.
it?
Yep, I can see it perfectly.
Okay, so Bridgewater, an RHS garden in the heart of the Northwest. So just for any of you out there who don't know where we are, I've just got a little bit of a sort of orientation initially. So hopefully you can see a map with Manchester on the right hand side there, and circumventing Manchester is the M60 motorway all the way around, and just sort of above 9 o'clock, maybe 10 o'clock, off that ring road that runs all the way around the Greater Manchester area is Worsley, and we're just on the edge of Worsley, between Worsley and Boothstown, on the tip of that arrowhead, not surprisingly enough. So that's where we're located. Just flipping through to the next aerial shot that I have of the site, you can see on the right hand side the M60 motorway, right over on the right there, with a slip road coming off, and then hopefully you can make out across the bottom of the picture there a sort of ochre brownish ribbon just running from left to right or right to left. That's the Bridgewater Canal, and the garden is north uphill from the Bridgewater Canal, and it pretty much occupies all of the central portion of that aerial image that you've got. So there's some fields at the bottom just above the canal, which is called Victorian Meadow. Then it moves into that big band of woodlands that you can see, Middlewood. We have Eastwood as well. On the left hand side of that woodland, you can see a sort of grey area, some hard landscaping. That's the walled garden. And then you can probably just about make out a sort of clearing of water within the woodlands as well. That's part of the historic lake. And then up towards the top left, there's a field, a lighter coloured field, and that's the site of our future arboretum. Now, in all, the site covers about 154 acres, but that just gives you a good overview of the site. It doesn't really take into account the topography, the slope of the site. So it falls from the top, the north, heading south through about 35 metres. So the whole site slopes on a north to south orientation, so it's a south facing slope. And then the soils are quite interesting across the site, in that just above the ochre brown ribbon, the Bridgewater Canal that you can see at the bottom on Victorian Meadows, those are all peaty soils. Those historically were part of Chat Moss. When the Bridgewater Canal was constructed, Chat Moss was drained, turned over to agricultural land, and it's left us with these rich peaty soils through that lower portion of the site. And then as you move up into the middle wood, through the walled garden, and where the lake is in the middle of the wall, that middle third, if you like, those are all clays, post-glacial clays. And the top end of the site, up towards the road and where the top field is sand. So it's quite unusual in that we have three very different textures of soil on site. Obviously every garden has one, and some are blessed with two, but to get three distinctive soil types in one garden is quite unusual. I've certainly never worked anywhere with three. I'm not sure I visited any either that I can remember. Someone can correct me at the end. There's 158 people on this call. Someone will definitely know of three or more, so answer on a postcard. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the heritage of the site, just so you've got some sort of understanding. Now, forgive me for anyone who's heard this part of the talk before. I know Indy came a few years ago to one that I gave at the Dorothy Clive, and I think this was probably a part of the talk that I gave then. But I think it's really important to understand how the RHS is respecting the heritage of the site. The garden itself constitutes a number of firsts for the Royal Horticultural Society. It's the first time that it's sought to create a garden in a heritage context. Wisley has created its own heritage over the last 100 years, but it wasn't a heritage site when it was taken on. It's also the first time that the RHS has taken on a garden from scratch. There was already a garden at Wisley, there was already a garden at Hyde Hall and Rosemoor and Harlow Carr. There was a nucleus that they built around and expanded, but this is pretty much from scratch, the heritage aside. And it's also the first time that it's built a garden in such close proximity to such a big urban conurbation. Obviously Wisley, Hyde Hall and Rosemoor are all very rural gardens, and Harlow Carr does sit at the top of Harrogate, but you'd hardly call it a great sprawling urban conurbation. It's a town. So it's quite different in terms of its approach on a number of levels, which I'll explain as we go through the talk. So obviously the garden is named after the canal, and the canal is named after the 3rd Duke of Bridgewater, Francis Egerton. Now, he made his money through a combination of owning the local coalfields in this part of the country, up in Worsley, Delph and around the Manchester area, and also through the construction of the canal itself, which he got planning for in 1759 and then quickly turned around, and by 1761 the first stretch was open from Worsley, the coalfields that he had in Worsley Delph, right through to the centre of Manchester. There were later extensions made out towards Warrington and further afield, but the initial section went from Worsley through to Manchester. Now, the construction cost I've written up on the screen there at the time was £168,000. Supposedly that's 25 million today. I imagine it would actually cost quite a lot more than that to build a canal of that length, knowing that the restoration or the recreation of the garden at Bridgewater has cost 35 million. I do sometimes wonder about these numbers in terms of equivalencies that are put out there. But anyway, that's mathematically what it is. And when he died heirless. He left the estate and his fortune to his nephew, who was the Duke of Sutherland. And in a strange twist of the will, and I'm always quite interested in this aspect of it, because having worked at Trentham and actually living in Trentham, the link between the Sutherlands, the Lewson Gore family, and the Egertons, the Ellesmere family, is very tight, and I'll explain why. So he left it to his nephew, the Duke of Sutherland, but it was on the proviso or the understanding that when that nephew died, rather than the rules of primogeniture applying and everything passing down to his eldest son, it went to his second son, as long as that son changed his name to Egerton. So sure enough, he died in 1803. The nephew that he left it to died in the 1830s, and his great-nephew inherited the site at Bridgewater at that time, Worsley Hall, Worsley Old Hall, and then went on a spending spree. Here he is, Lord Francis Egerton, later the first Earl of Ellesmere. So this is the great-nephew of the Duke of Bridgewater. And he went on this spending spree when he inherited all of this wealth. In the 1830s, 1840s, he built Worsley New Hall, he built the terraces, he built the walled garden, he built all of the infrastructure which the RHS has inherited and which we're creating a garden around. So the heyday of the gardens, and quite often the heyday of all gardens, it seems, is written down across the country, appears to be in the Victorian period, when there was oodles of cash splashing around and lots of labour and lots of time and attention paid into gardens up and down the country. And that zenith really lasted up until the beginning of the First World War, and then there was huge socio-economic change, as there was across the country. A loss of labour, changing attitudes towards working as servants or as gardeners. Society shifted and altered. And at the end of the First World War, the Ellesmeres took the decision to sell the estate. It was eventually sold in 1923 to a group of local Manchester businessmen. But for the preceding 60 plus years, the garden flourished, was in all the journals, including Royal Horticultural Society journals, on a number of levels, had a huge team, about 34 full-time gardeners. And there's a lovely shot of one of the longest serving head gardeners, William Upjohn, in the doorway to Garden Cottage, which was the head gardener's house, which is still on site. And you can just about, in the top right-hand corner there, see an old shot of that from 1910, from the Edwardian period. So, you know, the walled garden itself was obviously a hub, as I've written here, of food and flower production, serving both the house and actually the staff who worked on the estate for 60 or 70 years. And then the house itself had quite a potted history. the Ellesmeres lent it out as a convalescent home for officers in the First World War, and we've got a wealth of historical information, archival information, leaflets, pamphlets, postcards, books, photographs from the Great War from 1914 to 1918. I've put just a few shots up on the left-hand side there. There's some officers, including a Scotsman there, sat in a boat on the boating lake. Another officer moving through the Nestfield Terraces on crutches. Many of the Red Cross team that worked on the site in that large photograph at the top. And then on the right-hand side, there's a map of the walled garden, which luckily enough has a date on it. It's the 12th of August, 1942. And that obviously links into the Dig for Victory campaign and all of the food production that was going on right across the country at that point in time. And obviously the walled garden was still operating in very much the same way at that point that it had done up until the transition after the First World War. It kind of had a resurgence in terms of its growing. But all of the paths, the buildings, the glass houses, all of the inheritance from the Victorian Edwardian period was still extant and in situ at that point in time. It was in the 1960s, as with a lot of heritage across the country, that elements got pulled down and swept away, although thankfully not all. So after the Second World War, the house was slowly degrading, crumbling. There was a fire. There always seems to be a fire with lots of these old mansions, and the decision was taken to pull down Worsley New Hall. Now, bearing in mind, it had been built in the 1840s, so it had a lifespan of about 100 years, and then got demolished. There's a dramatic shot of it, during demolition on the left-hand side there, and all of the materials from the building was sold for scrap. And interestingly, nearly all the stone went to build 100 council houses in Hebden Bridge. And the head of site lives in Hebden Bridge, so he knows exactly where all those houses are. And I've got some photographs of where all this stonework went. Quite nice council houses. And at that point in time, the estate, should I say, rather than the garden, really had a multiplicity of uses. Middlewood was turned over to a scout camp. The historic lakes became an angling club. The walled garden set up a nursery. The fields and wider areas had agricultural tenancies. There was a whole fragmentation of the usage of the site. And I think because there were so many fragmented uses, the original vision for the site started to drift, and lots of unusual developments, let's put it that way, took place across the site, many of which we've spent quite a lot of time sweeping away more recently. So I've got this sort of post-war decline shot that I've got up. This huge concrete bunker, this mammoth building, lies just to the west of where Worsley New Hall once stood, at the top of the Nestfield Terraces, and it was put in as a civil defence bunker during the Cold War, and served as such for about 20 years, maybe fractionally less than that, but certainly through until the late 1960s. And then I believe Russian bomb technology developed so far that it was penetrable and was no longer of any use as a civil defence bunker. And at that point, it became a rifle range, and then it became derelict. And there are some shots somewhere on YouTube of it being used as a rave den through the 90s and the early 2000s. So there's this general sort of picture of decline and changing use. The walled garden itself, the nursery evolved into a garden centre, a very successful one, profitable one, I think, as well. And the Scouts continued to utilise Middlewood for the glades for camping and scouting activities. So the RHS took ownership of the site officially in July of 2017. They've been hunting for a garden since 2015, seriously hunting for a garden. Jim Gardner, who was the director of horticulture and previous curator at RHS Wisley, eventually plumped for this as one of the two front runners. The other front runner was actually Park Hall in Stoke-on-Trent. There were two.
Oh no,
Yeah, and it would have been a slightly easier commute for me across the Park Hall. And obviously that's got lots of geological advantages. Allotmenteering is big in Stoke, and it's quite tight. But in terms of the infrastructure on site and the potential through the walled garden, the soil types that I've talked about already, and a lot of the terracing, lakes, topography, this was the clear winner over Park Hall in Stoke-on-Trent. And the first thing that was done was, once it was agreed this was definitely the site, and the governing body, the council, and the executive leadership team of the RHS had decided this was the site that they wanted, was they employed Tom Stewart Smith, TSS, as written on there, to produce an overall master plan, a vision, if you like, of how the site could be developed and evolved into the RHS's fifth garden. And this is a huge drawing. It's actually about 6 feet long. There's a number of watercolours beautifully produced on a thick canvas. I think Sue Biggs, the Director General, has got one on her office wall in London, and there's a couple of other copies knocking around. We want one at Bridgewater. We haven't got one, but hopefully we'll get one at some point. And it is just worth glancing at that, because obviously I showed you that aerial image before in which you could see that dense woodland, dense fields, the Victoria Meadow, and then you kind of got a bit of a blurred outline of the walled garden, and it was quite difficult to discern anything else, primarily because it's quite overgrown, so a lot of the features have sort of been swamped. This master plan really revolves around two key horticultural hubs, two epicenters of horticultural excellence, if you like. First is the walled garden and its immediate curtilage, its immediate environs, which is what we've been working on for the last 4 years or thereabouts. And secondly, and longer term, in a more strategic sense, is the old site of Worsley New Hall and its associated terraces, which is up in the top right-hand corner of the picture, the sort of the rectilinear box that you can see in the middle of the woodlands. And just to the south of that, you can see restored lakes, the same lake that I showed you the officers sat in a boat in World War I boating on. So that's the left-hand body of water there, Ellesmere Lake. So you've got these two anticipated centres of horticultural excellence, intense horticulture, and then a whole array of woodland gardens running and joining them, and the historic lake with the creation of a new lake, which is the big body of water towards the bottom left-hand corner, and then of course a whole infrastructure that's required in terms of a welcome building, a garden centre, teas, coffees, car parks, places to store your bike, etc., which is all down in that left-hand corner. You can just again see sort of in the bottom right-hand corner the Bridgewater Canal, which isn't looking an ochre brown colour, but it's shown as a sort of slight bluey grey, just ribbon along there. So that just hopefully gives you some orientation and understanding of the overall vision of the key elements at Bridgewater and how they'll work in the longer play. So when we open on May 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, whenever it actually lands as the finalised date, but it will be one of those dates, the extent of the site that will be open to the public of that 154 acres is about 120. There are 30 plus acres up in the top corner, including those terraces and a lot of those slopes that are cordoned off. Now, it will be possible to access those through pre-arranged behind the scenes tours only, but they haven't got any path network. It's a little bit hairy, etc. So it would be guided walks only, but the majority of the site, it will be open at the end of May. So I'm going to take you through the cleanup. I talked a little bit about the cleanup and some of the surprises, and this sort of gives you a bit of an overview of the challenges that we faced and what we've been up to. So this shot is taken February 2017 in the Paradise Garden, in the walled garden. You can see a derelict 1960s wooden glass house on the left. And if you look just above the top ridge line of the glass, into that section of brick wall, you can see some sandstone blocks, hopefully, sort of set into the wall. That's the original sandstone blocks and the heights that the Victorian glass house was set at. So a much taller structure, another sort of 3, maybe 4 feet further up the wall. These walls are enormous. I mean, they're 15, 16 feet tall walls, you know, big south-facing walls. And on the right-hand side, you can see something that was put up in the 80s, a sort of aluminium span glass house as well. And then obviously a lot of dereliction, weeds, things collapsing, all the glass is shot through. You get the picture. And on the right-hand side, you can hopefully just see some of the ivy that we had growing up the walls. So there was Virginia creeper, masses of ivy, sections of wall that were falling over. And in order to be able to assess the extent of the work that we needed to do to restore the walls, everything had to be cleared off them. So there was a big job in terms of stripping off ivy, taking down redundant, derelict, dangerous structures like the ones that you can see, and just being able to assess the amount of work that was required to make everything safe, but also to give it some integrity. So the opening that you can see there in the middle of the picture with some wrought iron gates in it, that's been carved through in the 1960s. Originally, there was a much smaller doorway with coining around it, and nice detailing above it, and it's just been carved through so you can drive a tractor through, just get vehicles in and out. And there were a number of points where the original design intent and some of the features around the garden had just been carved out for practicality. So again, these are some sort of shots of the Paradise Garden. Now, I mentioned it was a nursery and latterly a garden centre. And what had tended to happen is that over the years, the levels had been raised. So there was broken bottles, plastic pots, gravel, concrete, glass, timber that had just been used to fill holes. And the original soil level was actually a foot below these incremental builds-ups of rubble that then had either Mypex or gravel put over the top and ostensibly looked fine, but you had these big areas that needed excavating out so that we could actually get down to the soil and begin constructing what we wanted to construct. Now, one of the most challenging things that happened was that we discovered that the good old Victorians and into the Edwardian and possibly into the post-war years, as post-First World War years as well, had been spraying lead, arsenate with gay abandon across the site. So they were nuking anything that crept or crawled with this particularly noxious pesticide. And it's a pesticide that doesn't degrade when it comes into contact with the soil. It stays there for a long time and builds up. So all of the soils within the walled garden had hazardous levels of arsenic within them. Now, obviously, if we want to start growing apples and carrots and all sorts of other goodies, which you'd anticipate getting out of a walled garden, we needed to ensure that we got rid of the arsenic. Now, there were a number of solutions. There was a very, very long-term solution, which was to put in what are called hyperaccumulators, and there are a number of those. You can use salix, ferns, that will draw out the arsenic from the soil, hyperaccumulate it in the plants, and then you remove those plants. You can either then compost them, but the arsenic is in those plants, so you're just transferring it anyway. It doesn't disappear, it just moves into the plant. But it takes a long time, even with hyperaccumulators, to get rid of the arsenic. So we decided to do a soil transfer, dig out all of the walled garden areas, and we're talking 6,500 cubic meters of soil, huge volumes. Bearing in mind, a massive lorry is 20 cube. You can kind of do the maths and extrapolate how many lorries up. So it's a lot of lorries in and out of there. And then replace the soil with soil that we want on site. So when we built the car parks, which were on that peaty soil that I talked about in the lower meadows, we stripped everything to 10 inches. It might have been a foot deep, stockpiled all that at the relevant heights, did the construction, and then re-imported the soil from another part of the site, which wasn't laced with arsenic, to reuse on site. The arsenic soils that we have been taken elsewhere, and they're fine to grow ornamentals on. They're not hazardous to health. It's purely if you're growing edible crops. So in terms of having a contaminated soil, it only counts as a contaminated soil if you're growing edibles on it. So the soil has been retained on site, but it's fine for ornamentals. So we had this big kind of almost game of musical chairs of moving, you know, the soils around the site, which was a big challenge and quite a lot of extra cost. So again, here's some other shots of some of the challenges that we were facing. A lot of planting that had gone on around the walled garden was either misinformed, hadn't been managed, or had self-seeded its way in. So the left-hand picture that you can see there, you can see a lot of downy birch, lovely tree. We've got a lot of them. We've retained a lot of them on site. All of those downy birch were actually growing out the foot of the walls, which we needed to repair. So they're all pretty much all self-sown trees in there, so they had to be removed. On the left-hand side, the extreme left of that picture, you can see a leyland cypress hedge that someone had forgot to cut for about 30 years. So they had to go. And then if you look at in the middle picture, just behind the digger arm and the pile of logs that were coming out of things that we had to remove in order to be able to build the garden, you can see again a lot of conifers that have been planted around Garden Cottage, possibly dwarf conifers that were supposed to be kept clipped and proportionate to the building, but of course they've grown into monsters, were dwarfing the building, and were generally on the south side of the building casting shade as well. So we had a lot of removals to do, either because of a lack of planning in the past or thought, or a lack of maintenance mainly. So a lot of clear up of tree work on site just to be able to get things in order for us to be able to plant to fulfill the vision and the aspirations for the site. So again, more shots and some of the shots in here. This is probably where I've got a bit too much of a montage going. I did mention this at the start. It could get a bit fussy, so just bear with me. In the top left-hand corner, that I think was called Storm Dennis, from memory. And Storm Dennis arrived in February of 2018, I think. And there's a horse chestnut gone over there, and they planted a line of horse chestnuts along a bund of rubble. So not surprisingly, when a big wind hit them, they didn't have much to root into, so they started crashing through the walls, and that's one example of a horse chestnut that crashed through the walls. And then if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner, this is a huge coal bunker underground, which was built in the 1840s with a chimney behind it, an engine house, a bothy chimney. And down this chute that you can see, into this tunnel, they'd transport the coal. And at the back of it, there was it's not there anymore, there was a boiler which had a tube that fits directly into the huge chimney that you can see at the back. And interesting, there are still sulfur residues from the coal they burnt inside this tube. You can smell it, and it's really strong, the yellow sulfur that's inside there. And that was the heating mechanism that they used on the walled gardens for about 40 years through until the 1880s, 1890s, and then it was superseded by a second boiler house. But the system they employed was the Trentham case system. So it was developed at Trentham Gardens by the head gardener there called George Fleming, but it doesn't take too much of a leap of imagination to imagine the younger brother, Francis Egerton, the Earl of Ellesmere, getting wind of the fact that his elder brother, the Duke of Sutherland, was putting in this new technology at Trentham and utilising it at Bridgewater, or Worsley New Hall as was then. So there's a really nice sort of engineering link between the two sites there. And then again, there's various shots of falling down walls and tumbling over things, and just a general sense of a lot of let's say there was no stitch in time. to save 9, and we were definitely on the 9 or the 18 or the 27 or whatever the multiplication factor of that was. We were at the end of a long process of no stitches in time having happened. So similar, I mean, I've talked quite a lot about the buildings, and I've talked about arsenic, and I've talked about contamination that we had in the soil. One of the other big challenges was Rhododendron ponticum, and we had Himalayan balsam, which is obviously easier to manage as it annually seeds, and not surprisingly there was some Japanese knotweed, but not a huge volume, you know, smaller areas, manageable areas that we've treated. But Rhododendron ponticum was really rampant through the woods, acres and acres and acres of it. So obviously it poisons the soil, it doesn't allow other plants to flourish, it's highly invasive. I mean, it's a bully. So we spent a lot of time clearing through lower middle wood, and it's primarily a sycamore wood, a seedling sycamore wood, because the original oak wood was felled and sold for timber in the 1950s. There is some oak in there, but the majority is sycamore that's come in post 1950s felling, and then this Rhododendron ponticum. So we had big task force of a combination of contractors and volunteers, and that left-hand picture shows Lissa, one of our volunteer management outs, leading a group of volunteers, rhododendron bashing, which was a very popular job actually for a couple of years through lower Middlewood. So that's a lot on the clearance and the challenges. So once we kind of cleared the decks, got rid of all the stuff that we knew we couldn't integrate within the gardens, either because it was Leyland cypress that was 50 feet high, or trees growing out the foot of walls, or soils that were contaminated with arsenic, etc., etc., we began the construction and implementing of the plans. So the time of diggers, I call this, which sort of ran through from about July 2018 through until probably the end of last year, although there's the odd little mini digger still around on site now in the final dash for the line. We had a lot of wall repairs to do. So we had a contractor, May Sand, who were on site. The walls on the site, they're not quite a mile, but it's about 1.4 kilometres of walls to repair, rebuild, repoint, coping stones to resort. A huge job. We had a team of bricklayers on site for a year, just repairing the walls of the wall garden. All done to this Flemish bond, so a very specific style, and all done using traditional techniques and lime mortars. So it's a really beautiful sort of restoration job that's been undertaken all around the gardens, but really critical to get that framework and that backdrop right. Now, it is important to point out that Bridgewater is not a garden restoration per se. It's a garden in which we've restored the frame, the walls and the historic elements, but the new garden that's being put across it is entirely contemporary. So it's the analogy I draw is the picture frame is historic, but the painting is new. And this is the process of actually repairing that picture frame or one of the elements that was done within it. So the soil being moved back into the garden, a dumper load at a time. Now, bearing in mind, I said there was 6,500 cubic meters taken out. Now, obviously, we put in quite a lot of paths and hardscape and so forth. So we probably only had to pull back in about 5,000 cubic meters, but it was still a lot when you're doing it, you know, a cube or two at a time. A lot of trips back and forth through quite complicated path networks. And on that right-hand side, you can see someone sort of cleaning off some paint from the wall. Now, on that wall, there was a furniture showroom had been built, I think, in its latter years, and they painted the back wall white. And so there was a lot of kind of cleaning up of those accretions that were unacceptable in terms of the backdrop that we wanted to create on site. And then this shot is taken, the left-hand shot is from May of 2019, when Tom Stewart Smith did a garden at Chelsea on the triangle that was inspired by Bridgewater. And a lot of the plants, not all of them, but about 90% of the plants came back to the garden and got reused either in the Welcome Garden or in the Paradise Garden. And some of the key features, like the big portal that you can see, the big metal structure with the wooden slats, that came back to Bridgewater and as part of the welcome garden. In fact, it's part of a trio. It was one of 3 that we put in as these decision-making points that that take you along a path, which I think I've got some shots of later. And on the right-hand side, you can see, you know, I showed you those tumble-down glass houses earlier. Those have gone, and we're starting to construct the garden after this reduced level dig up. So essentially, we got down to the subsoil, took all the arsenic soils away, then built the paths up like a floating path network that created beds as holes, and then we had to come back in and fill all the beds one at a time, painstakingly, agonizingly over a long period. And I kept going to meetings in London being asked, when are you going to finish the soil move? And I was like, it's going to take quite a while. I think it took us about 6 months. And after about 4 months, everyone was getting a bit twitchy and asking me questions about how much longer it was going to take. I was like, we're nearly there. We're just at the difficult bit now. The 90%, just this last 10% is tricky, but we got there in the end. So I talked a lot about the walls, repairing the walls, taking the ivy off the walls, how important the walls are. Now, this picture here really sort of gives an indication. There's some stats on there as well about how important the walls are as a canvas for some of the things that we're doing. So within the kitchen garden, we really want to celebrate the art and craft of pruning in 2 planes. So formative pruning against walls, espaliers, palmettes, cordons, W cordons, Belgian fence, every possible permutation that you can imagine, we will have on display across these walls. Now, that's obviously a really nice link to the heritage of the site, but it will also create this beautiful tapestry and optimize this backdrop. It's not all the walls of the wall garden, it's just one portion that we're doing it in. But in terms of the amount of wiring that went on across the Paradise kitchen garden and some of the other bits, they put in 5.7 kilometers of wire, 5,590 vine eyes, all individually hammered in, all beautifully done in line with the Flemish bond, and then these 570 tensioners. Again, a lot of what we've done is just on a really big scale. So, you know, when you're wiring up a wall at home, or, you know, I've done in the past, it might be you're on it for a couple of days or a weekend job, or, you know, maybe a bigger job, it might be a week. I mean, these guys were on it for a couple of months. That's all they were doing. It's just wiring and getting them in and setting them straight and ensuring that, you know, each one of those nails was set to the same depth on a jig so that the wires ran through. Really painstaking attention to detail. And then this is quite a nice aerial shot of the garden starting to emerge, footprints, path networks. So off on the left-hand side, you can see some very linear lines running up and down the screen. That's drainage that's being put in there and some of the outer garden spaces. And then the bottom section shows the Paradise Garden, big sort of square pool being excavated at the center of the garden, path network coming up on the right, a kind of spider's web effect on the left coming up, and the kitchen garden above it. And these 2 gardens of the inner wall garden very much act in tandem together. Symmetrically, they're the same, exactly the same in terms of their footprint, but they're obviously divided by a really large wall, you know, that's up over 10 feet high. But they interrelate in a very strong way through the path networks on the 2. So I just think that gives quite a good snapshot in time of the work going on, the path construction. There's no plants, hardly any of the soil's been moved back in, and that's just the hardcore construction going on. And then here it's moving on a little bit further, soil starting to move back into beds. That pond that I talked about has been lined by this point in time. No glass houses, again, no plants at all. So this is the summer of 2019. And then we started doing some initial planting in the autumn of 2019. Obviously, originally we were intending on opening in the summer of 2020. So there was going to be this protracted planting period from September of 2019 all the way probably through until the end of May, maybe into June of 2020, ready for July, and then COVID hit. But anyway, that's another story. So again, a sort of montage of this slowly building crescendo of works and other elements. So I focus on the paradise and kitchen garden a bit from a number of the shots, but here you can see in the bottom left-hand corner a series of community yard gardens, which are shown as little boxes between the beech hedge. And then you've got this sort of leaf pattern that's emerging as well, that's half built, and that's pretty much up to date. That photograph's been taken in the last week. So that leaf pattern, the lighter areas are path that have just been done in bark chip, and then the darker areas will have salix, corylus, cornus, things that will coppice within the garden and use within the garden as well. So we're trying to do things in a very sustainable sense in terms of not buying in. We'll have our own bean poles, we'll have our own pea sticks. We can make our own sort of edging, weave that with a willow. And then in the bottom sort of center of that picture, you can see a series of hexagonal beds. That's one of the community grow areas. So these are almost like micro allotments of varying heights and sizes. And I think I've got some more close-up detailed shots of those. That one is quite an up-to-date shot as well from this year. And then just moving back to a comparison of one of the original drawings. So I showed you that aerial view, and that's part of a suite of drawings. This was one of Tom's original visualizations from 2016. This drawing was done. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the correlation with the work that we've been implementing for the past few years. Certainly the Paradise Garden, with its centralized pool, glass houses, rectilinear layout, is pretty much exactly as per that original visualization. And then the other areas, the designs have evolved: the kitchen garden, the trials area, the orchards, the community grow, but they're very much in the spirit of that original drawing. They've just been nuanced and altered. So moving into the sort of some really bringing up to date, you've seen, you know, sites being stripped down, soil, concrete, digging, guys with laying bricks. This is really sort of bringing you up to how the garden really developed over this year and began to flower and bed in. So the Welcome Garden, the team finished planting in April of 2020, and this is its first season. You know, 2020, this is how it was looking summer and autumn time. So top left-hand corner, you can see Salvia religiosa coming through there, eupatoriums, phyllictrums. I can see sort of some achilleas, really sort of strong Tom Stuart Smith frothy design. The right-hand side, you can see the kind of intricacy of the patterning of that, of how you move and interrelate with that garden. Some people have described it as like the patterning on a giraffe's back. Technically, I think it's inspired by a mathematical term called Voronoi. I'm not going to go into the details of that. I'm going to have a glass of water. And then again, some other shots, bottom left, sort of looking through. It's a wet meadow effect that we've got in there. So there's Darmeras, a lot of Lithrums, Persicarias, Siberian Iris, a really sort of classic, soft, pastel Tom Stuart Smith scheme. And then in the middle shot, beautiful sky. I mean, it's a great picture, I think, with the clouds and the blue sky. You can see these shaggy yew domes that we bought in. I think they were purchased in Belgium and had quite a long period in quarantine, that sit on a very crisp lawn that greets you as you move into the garden. And if you look above that, so just above the Voronoi pattern, you can see that long strip of grass, and just punctuate it, there's some dots. Those are the yew. And then there's another shot under them that kind of show you how they are. And, you know, those are big clumps of yew, 8 feet in diameter, something like that, 3 or 4 feet tall. They sit there really nicely. And then on just to the right of those Taxus domes, the yew domes that I've just mentioned, you can see, I think it's some Phyllictrum and possibly some Lithrum and beech topiary, and you can see a crossbar, which is the crossbar from the show garden that I showed you at Chelsea. That's it come back, that big metal space frame. That's a part of it in that picture. Some shots of the kitchen paradise garden again. So an original plan by Tom with glass houses, lily ponds in the central, a kind of North American type planting around that. So it's ethnobotanically in thirds. The central portion is North American planting. The left-hand side is Asiatic, and then the right-hand side is Mediterranean climate zone. A few different shots that I've kind of thrown in there. Late autumn sort of shot November. You can see the asters sort of showing up, and the russets on the beach columns that we've got, and then that bottom left-hand corner. A winter shot, I think that is from sort of February, which is showing the strong structures of the grasses. Right hand with the Tetrapanax papifera that you can see in there, Salvia amistad, verbenas through it. That's a summer shot, obviously. I think that's August from memory. And then just up in the sort of top right hand corner, there's a shot looking down inside one of the two glass houses. That's the Mediterranean glass house. You can see the grilling on the floor, the new built walls, the span, how we've painted the original walls that were there. And the footprinting of those is pretty much in line with the historic Victorian glass houses that stood there. So if you remember, I pointed out some sandstone blocks and said, oh, that wooden glass house that they put in the 60s was much shorter. These are proportionate to the space. They look much more elegant, and they sit in the space much better. And then some shots of the kitchen garden, Harrisburg design up in the top left. Bottom left, so I've sort of just popped back in that sort of training forms that we're doing against the walls, which is quite a key point of the design. And then there's just a few shots. I'm not quite sure how well you can see them. On my screen, there's pictures of people on the right. They're obscuring some of them. But just to the left of, I've got Indy and Juliet Niven on my screen. There's a climbing frame that you can see there. Now, these are inspired by the Bothy chimney. So we've got these big structures for climbing plants up that sit through the garden that have some real stature and presence, but that relate very strongly to that big chimney feature that you've got in the back of the frame yard. And then there are water features, so you can see that very clear blue rectilinear block. That's a raised water feature. These are inspired by the Bridgewater Canal, and we will have edible aquatics in a lot of those through the kitchen garden itself. And then just behind the bar that I've got that says you are screen sharing and you share and all sorts of things. There's some shots of the team who took the opportunity this summer to use the central portion of the garden, the classic kitchen garden, as allotments to grow their own stuff in out of hours. And that was useful for us as well, because we could see which crops did well, which didn't like it as much, how the winds performed. And it's certainly, any garden you kind of learn from your mistakes in some ways. And there are certain plants that we wouldn't put in exactly the same place again because they just didn't perform for a variety of reasons. It's not quite as sheltered in there, that central portion. There's a bit of a wind tunnel. So things like the beans took a bit of a blast. It was quite a difficult year, I think, with the hot April, May as well. We seem to be using copious amounts of water. But the summer and spring effect that we had, there were a few other nuances that we had to learn about how to grow in that space, which was useful. So I haven't got designs and images for every portion of the garden because I haven't got time, and I'm not quite sure what time we're on now. Are we okay, Indy, at the moment?
Yeah. Don't worry, we've got plenty of time. Yeah, go on as long as you want.
Yeah. So this is the Chinese Streamside garden, which is a part of the woodland garden that we're developing as a cross-cultural collaboration with the British Chinese community in the Northwest, and also with mainland China as well, with the China Flower Association. So the Chinese Streamside garden covers about 7 acres. It's part of the woodlands, the lower Middlewood area. And we really wanted to develop, to celebrate the huge contribution made to not only UK, but European and world horticulture by Chinese plants. we all benefit hugely from the biodiversity of China. I mean, the number of species specific to China that have been imported to UK gardeners and the parents of British cultivars is numerous. For every British native plant, there's about 20 from China. I mean, so the ratio in terms of biodiversity is huge. And obviously, in terms of rhododendrons, azaleas, magnolias, cornus, you know, there's a huge array of plants that we use. And initially, we were seeing it purely as a botanical exercise. So we'd have a rhododendron glade, a Davidia involucrata kind of grove, a Chinese meadow, Betula albosinensis. We know birch does really well. So it was going to be very botanically driven. And then we started working with some Chinese partners in the Northwest, Dr. Li Kai-hong and Jerry Young, sorry. And both of them were very keen to explore the cultural crossover and also to create a genuinely classic Chinese garden at Bridgewater. And this was something that we initially, and I say we, and I mean myself and the Director of Horticulture and some other members of the RHS team, were a bit, I wouldn't say skeptical, but just a little bit nervous of, cautious about, because stylistically, British gardens and Chinese gardens are very, very different in terms of the materials, the structures, the nuances. And it's one thing building a Chinese garden in isolation, quite easy, but to integrate it within a heritage context and a woodland and make it fuse naturally and not jar in its context is quite a challenge. And we've slowly gone through that process, and Tracy, the garden manager at Bridgewater, and myself went to China a couple of years ago and visited various Chinese gardens, and we've looked at styles which are more muted and naturalistic in terms of the use of their materials. So a lot of wood that sits in context rather than stone, imperial style, like Beijing style. If you've been to the, you know, the summer palaces and things, I mean, they are impressive, and it's red paint and purple and gold and lots of things which in an impressive, grandiose context would work well. It might work well next to Buckingham Palace or in Regent's Park or in, you know, a similarly grandiose British context, but it isn't going to work in a wood in the UK. So we were really looking at that kind of more rustic Chinese tradition, and the style that we've ended up pursuing as potentially compatible is a Yangzhou, which is in central China, and we looked at a series of buildings there that we feel could integrate well into the context and harmonize and blend, not work against. And we've been going through a very careful process back and forth of tweaking how the two things work together. So there'll be this 7-acre garden will be all around the perimeters for the majority of it, botanically driven, plant driven, and there'll be a fusion between British woodland plants and Chinese plants, which will be which is in our comfort zone and which we can do very well, and is actually the easier part to achieve. The more complex element is integrating these strong cultural Chinese elements. So a music pavilion, an arts pavilion, a chess pavilion, an assemblage of structures which all interplay with one another around a courtyard at the heart of the Chinese garden. So you'd almost, the journey that will eventually take people on, you'll move through a very soft transition where actually you probably have, you'd have to be either quite a good gardener or a very good botanist to actually spot what the differences are between the British and the Chinese natives. It'll be subtle, and you go on close inspection, think, oh, that's not, you know, in a native English meadow, that's something slightly different, and then you'd work it out. But as you move deeper into the garden, it would become more and more Chinese in feel until you get to the center, the heart of the garden, and then it's a full, classically designed Chinese centerpiece. And it's not designed by people from the RHS, by some white British people. It's designed by the Chinese in China. So it will have integrity to them, you know, for British Chinese people, but for Chinese visitors as well. Because the last thing in the world we want is you know, that awful moment where, you know, we're quite pleased with what we've done, and they come along and that'll be very nice, and then they're kind of walking off going, they haven't got a clue and they don't know what they're doing in terms of understanding and that cultural immersion. So that whole process of working together on the bits that we're good at, which is the botanical blending and the planting side, with the bits that they're good at, has been an ongoing process. And the first toe that we dipped in the proverbial water with it was with the Chinese water garden. So there are two specific elements that a Chinese designer, Mr. Fan from Yangzhou, is designing for us. The first was the Chinese water garden, which we completed this winter, which is in the top left-hand picture. His design is the central drawing that you can see, the aerial view, and that's an assemblage of stone, which is very carefully put together and has symbolism and meaning in terms of the way that you site the stones, stand the stones together, and a whole planting scheme which has been put together by Mr. Fan. Now, it did have we had a little bit of toing and froing about perhaps a couple of the plants that wouldn't take the harder British weather. So there were a couple that he was maybe slightly optimistic about, that we suggested a few alternatives, and then there was a bit of tennis, if you like, back and forth, and then we came to an agreement on what those were, and then we've planted up that garden. So it's a Chinese design, slightly tempered by our understanding of the climatic conditions here, which will be open when you visit in May. You'll be able to go and see the Chinese water garden designed by Mr. Fan and led in the field and implemented by one of the garden managers, Tracy Snell, on our behalf. Now, and I think that will become one of the iconic features at the garden. I mean, it's a really strong area, and it sits at the foot of Ellesmere Lake, and it starts the journey through the garden, depending on which end you approach it from, or it's either the start or the end, depending on which way round the clock you go. But the next big phase of planning for us is working in partnership to make this central core work. So in terms of the orientation and in terms of the way that it blends and melds into the surrounding landscape. Really exciting proposition, but that'll be something that we're working on over the next year or two. But we hope when we open to be able to share some of the potential visualizations of how this could look. And these pastel drawings that you can see on the right-hand side, I don't know how well you can see. Can you see them, Indy? Okay.
Yeah, I can see the plan.
But they give you some idea of how it sits in the context of the woods and how it melds back and forth. So it's very strongly, overtly Chinese in style and design, but it'll be something that you build up towards and emerge to. You won't see this from a mile away or 300 yards away. You'll follow this snaking route and then arrive, and it will build up in intensity, and then it should be, wow, this is amazing. that's what we want to elicit. So I've talked quite a lot about the Chinese Streamside garden there. Just coming back to the sort of wall garden area, community grow. Now the ethos, and I sort of alluded to this at the start of the talk, at Bridgewater is quite different to a lot of the other gardens from the outset, in that we have worked in partnership with Salford Council very carefully. Salford Council purchased the site from Peel. They lease it to the RHS, so they own the site. It's on a 999-year lease. They've invested a lot of money into the site as well, and both on and off in terms of the road structures. So to the tune of, I think it's about £19 million Salford Council have put into the project. And one of the key things that they want to see is the difference that Bridgewater makes to the local community, to local people, to local prospects. And a big part of what we're doing isn't just create a visitor attraction that you come and are inspired by and think, wow, that's amazing, and take ideas from and then go home, but it's directly providing training through apprenticeships, which we do anyway, but community outreach via a wellbeing garden, a learning garden, which other sites do. But this one that I'm showing you here is our community grow garden. And the idea behind this is where people come together in groups and learn to grow for a year or two as a community group. So rather than maybe taking on an allotment, which is their patch, and Ned's on one and Sally's on another and Fred's on another and Catherine's on the next one, and they work in not in silos, but just next to each other, almost in competition, potentially. They work together harmoniously and collectively in this bee-like setting. I'll leave you to work out the symbolism, this hive of growing. Now, this was designed in the pre-COVID world where we wanted everyone to get close and personal. So social distancing wasn't designed into this at all. It's the antithesis of that. It was meant to bring people together to work side by side and chat. And we've cited things like, you know, specific number. There's a little degree of social engineering here in terms of standpipes. So standpipes are the gossip points, apparently. They're like the photocopiers in the office. So we've got a specific number of those people to go and have a gossip and going around. But then to work together on these spaces. And you can see there's some really big hexagons in the middle. There's 4 of them. The idea with those is that we would have students who are supposed to have 25 square meters to grow edible crops on, to learn themselves for a year. So as part of their RHS studentship, they have 25 square meters of ground to grow, and they are integrated in the center of these community plots. Now you should create a virtuous circle, we hope, there of communication, in which the students are naturally filtering out to the community groups what they're doing, and the community groups are taking an interest, and the students are actually learning because they're having to explain what they're doing to all these interested parties that are working around them, who are working on these micro plots. So it's quite a hybrid in terms of apprentices, students, community groups all coming together and working through this space. I think we've got about 50 odd beds through there. They're arranged in pods, and at any one point in time, we can have about 10 or 12 community groups focusing on specific areas. And the beauty of the model, we hope, is that if you were to just divvy it up on a personal basis, Sally has one, Fred has another, etc. If Sally's poorly or Fred goes on holiday, then someone else has to do it, and you get this disjoint and disconnect. Whereas when you work around collectives of people, half a dozen or 10, they're all pitching in, and it doesn't matter if someone's on holiday or someone's poorly, because you'll have this mass to ensure that the work is done on the bits that we want being done. That's the theory. That's the theory. So that's just gives you an overview of how we're doing something slightly different. There are lots of other examples of that in terms of the garden, but that's, I think, one of the most powerful differences in terms of the model that we're setting up. Quite a lot of other sites, if you go and visit them, when they have a wildlife garden, a learning garden, a children's area, a volunteers area, a community grow, whatever those are, they're not centre stage in front of house. They're up the corner. Now, that's for one or two reasons. Either because it's a later initiative and suddenly that's the trendy thing. Wildlife gardens. Let's do it. Let's do a sustainable wildlife garden. Where can we put one of those? Oh, we'll put one over there. And it's and the garden grows out from the centre, and somewhere on the edge you'll have a wildlife garden, and somewhere else on the edge you have your volunteer plots and some allotments and children's bit tucked over there. This is right at the front of the garden with views straight onto the kitchen garden or across a low wall. So in theory, you should, you know, we're not tucking it up the corner being ashamed of it. We're celebrating that you can learn and develop. And yes, there's a show garden that's designed by a Chelsea garden winner across the wall. But it's just as important to learn. You have to start somewhere. Yeah. So it's quite a powerful message, I think, in terms of everyone's equal. You know, gardening is a great leveler, and it doesn't matter what your skills and ability are. You can come and work at an RHS garden. The orchard. So at the western ends of the walled garden, there's an orchard area which is about 3.5 acres. Now, this is obviously a much longer play in terms of development, and you can see the plan over on the left, which has an apple collection, plums, pears. What else have we got in there? Quince, mulberries, damsons. I think that's it. About 86 trees. They're all going to be grown as traditional farm type orchard trees. So they're on big stops, M25, M11s for the apples, Pyrus Kirschenschale for the pears. So these are big, long-lived trees that will be 100, 150, maybe 200 on the pears. You know, if we're lucky, that sort of longevity. So the spacing on them is quite big because we want to grow these big trees. And you could just see on that aerial shot up in the middle there, tiny little circles just dotted through where they're all going in through that area. So, and then a lot of the spaces through that will be sown with wildflowers. So this orchard really is a very environmentally driven space. The kitchen garden and the paradise garden are very driven by standards and excellence in horticulture. As the top line, all of those eastern and southern areas, the well-being, the community grow, the learning garden, the community coppice, those are all driven by communities, people. That's the top line. That's the most important thing. This end is driven by the environment, by sustainability, by long-lived trees. We've got a bee and butterfly garden in there, an apiary. We're going to put in a wildlife wall. We're keeping chickens. We develop the area using pigs. We cleared the grounds. We're putting in a forage fringe, which is derived from agroforestry principles. So it's a very low sort of impact, lots of wildflowers, lots of high insect biodiversity value. So quite a different sort of driver for that area. But it's one that will evolve over the next 5 to 10 years, whereas initially it will be a lot of grass and some little trees. And then I'm nearly there now. Trials. So I've talked about excellence in horticulture in those two central portions: kitchen garden, paradise garden, welcome garden as well, really. And then the community-driven spaces, which is all about learning and development and coaching and improving yourself. The orchard end is very kind of sustainability, environmentally driven. The northern part of the garden, the frame yard, is very science and technical as its top headline. And that's where we've got a big glass house. So it's all kind of gadgets and controls and humidity and light and temperature and all the rest of it, and a controlled growing environment for producing plants for the garden. And we'll have RHS trials where we'll assess plants' merit against the criteria set down for AGM awards. So the first trial that we're putting in woody is Hydrangea paniculata, and we've got 77 different cultivars, which will be in situ for 4 to 5 years. So, and they'll be assessed by the by a woody forum a few times a year. On a range of criteria: floriferousness, pest and disease resistance, reliability. You get the picture, and then they vote on that, and then at the end of it there'll be a certain number of those that are deemed worthy of receiving the Award of Garden Merit. And then we're also, not surprisingly, conducting quite a lot of vegetable trials. So I think this year we've got carrots, turnips, there's something else which I've forgotten. What's the other one? We're starting primulas. Forgotten what the other veg trial is. We're doing the year of the courgette, but that's not a trial. It's gone. Anyway, there's another vegetable as well, but it's getting late now, I'm getting tired. And it's all taking place in this northern frame yard area. And this has specifically been chosen again because historically that was the working area. The potting sheds were there. That coal tunnel I showed you was there. The big chimney, the glass houses were there. It's where all of that back of house stuff went on. So in that kind of spirit of science, technology, and that side of things, we've put trials growing back into that space, propagation as well. And then just in that bottom left-hand corner, those are the trials fields down at Wisley, just as, which are moving actually. They're moving into another site. And then there's just a little bit here, just at the end, about, you know, the huge amount of teamwork and community effort that's gone into everything that we've been doing. There's a shot of Andy, who's been a volunteer with us for about 3 years now. He's a carpenter, joiner. He's made loads of furniture for us, bird boxes, owl boxes. At the moment, he's making some garage doors, windows. I mean, he's a great advocate for us, works really hard and really enjoys it and is making a difference. Teams of people who've been out clearing either rhododendron ponticum that I showed you earlier, digging through the kitchen garden, planting in that bottom one. I think they're putting in a hazel coop in our section of work, or working wood for coppicing in the future. Groups from the Chinese community who've helped doing clearance on the Chinese Streamside garden, etc., etc. There's been loads and loads of people who've got involved. We've had over 800 volunteers on site. Now, obviously with COVID, it's reduced in terms of social distancing, tea rooms, toilet facilities. It's all got rather complicated and it's decelerated. But people have kept coming, including Andy in the top left-hand corner. He just hasn't stopped. It's just that we've had to reduce the capacity to manage the risk, because we were just having oodles of people before, and now we have kind of not oodles, but hopefully we'll build up again.
Yeah,
I'm getting very dry-throated now.
don't worry.
There we go.
Oh, fantastic, brilliant. That was really good. Really enjoyed that. Right. So, folks, have you got any questions? If you have, either put them in the chat box or use the virtual raise your hand function. I'm just going to stop the sharing if that's okay, Marcus.
Yes, of course.
Brilliant. While those questions are coming in, I thought I'd ask a couple. The garden's obviously been delayed, the opening, from July 2020, I think it was, to May, so almost a year.
Yeah.
Now, whenever I've been involved in any project, you're always working your derriere off to the nth degree to get everything done to the last minute, and then somebody, and because you always think, oh, I need more time, somebody hands you a lifeline and says you've got another year. So
yeah.
has that given you, I mean, I know obviously we've had the COVID crisis, but has that given you any opportunities to do more with the garden than what you would have done, or has it just all been tailed back because of COVID?
If we'd have opened in July of last year, that Chinese water garden that I showed you, that wouldn't have been in. That's been done post, so all the planting, all the construction. The stream would have been in, but none of the rocks or the planting. So that wouldn't have happened. We've done a lot of extra things through Lower Middlewood in terms of tree and shrub planting through this winter. And I think extra hedgerows have gone in around that. So there has been an extension in terms of what we're opening and showing. New path networks, we've gone up further around the lake. There has been an issue over reduced capacity through the COVID. So we haven't been able to work at the same pace. We've had half rotors and all sorts of stuff, but we have achieved more having an extra planting season. I just think it will look better. You know, I mean, I showed some shots of how the Welcome landscape looked after one growing season, or part of a growing season. It was all finished by April. It's looking great in August, September. I think it'll look amazing this year. You know, that second season, it'll really go. So I think it will make a big difference in terms of people coming to a garden. I know, you know, I was here when Trentham Gardens was restored, and it looked good the first year, but there was a lot of bare soil. You know, you kind of thought that's got good potential. That's going to look good in a year or two. So I think just rather than coming and think, oh, yeah, that's got potential, it's going to look good in a year or two, coming and go, wow, that looks amazing now, is a good thing.
Yeah, I remember visiting the new garden at RHS Wisley, the tropical gardens.
Yeah,
I remember visiting that as soon as it opened, and there was lots of and then I visited sort of a year later, and it was just completely different. So I'm guessing there's probably going to be a lot of that at Bridgewater, where you put the planting in, and you know, it's now had extra time to develop. Have you had to delay any of the planting? Because I know you said you were starting it from the end of 2019 to May. So did you delay it, or did you continue with the planting at that point?
We kept planting through 2020, sort of into May of 2020, and then obviously stopped, and then we've done a second tranche now. But it has taken the edge off for us, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So some questions that came through. How do RHS members get to the new Bridgewater garden after it opens? Can we book now?
Yeah, in terms of when the booking procedures take, it's still just fractionally in the air because we haven't got the date. So it's imminent. So all I can say on that one is just keep watching the website, but it will be pre-booking only.
Right. Okay.
For COVID as much as anything, I think that will stay in place, into the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you got any medlar trees for the orchard or other heritage varieties? And did you say mulberry too?
Yeah, I think we've got Chelsea, mulberry, Wellington. Forget what the other one is. The apples are a northwestern selection, so we've got everything from Cumbria, Cheshire, Lancashire, including Old Westmoreland, and one Max Codlin from the Isle of Man. So it's the complete Northwest apple collection. The pears are a heritage based upon, it was one of the few tangible things that we had left on site were a vestige pear collection that we had DNA analysed. We had 23 trees left, which had generally either been grown as cordons or some espaliers on the walls. Hadn't been pruned for 100 years and had obviously grown into top-heavy trees as a consequence of that. Couldn't be saved, but we took scion wood off them, repropagated at Frank Matthews near Tenbury Wells, and then have reintroduced off those. And we've got 14 heritage cultivars growing in the orchard, which are directly genetically linked to the material that we took from site.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Interesting question now. Does the clock at Worsley Church still strike 13 at 1 p.m? I
didn't know that. I'll have to ask. I don't know.
Stephen,
Who knows that?
Stephen, you're gonna have to elaborate on that one. Do you want to stick your hand up and then I can unmute you? Move on to the next question in the meantime. Any pergolas or laburnum or wisteria arches planned?
Yeah, we've got a pear tunnel, a grape tunnel, which are both going into the kitchen garden, but they haven't gone up yet. That's why you didn't see any pictures of those. So there's two walkways of that. Not necessarily wisteria. We are looking to put in a pergola as one of the entrances into the Paradise Garden, but that'll be at a later phase. That'll be in a couple of years, I think.
Okie dokie. As someone's asking, how long does it take you to travel there from Trentham, and which way do you go? I'm not sure if they're planning to follow you.
Yeah, I get on at 15. I go up to 21A. Then I drive down the M62 to junction 12, and then I get off again, and then I'm there. If I'm really, really lucky, it's about 50 minutes, which I have been in some of the lockdown, but it's generally an hour, and if I'm unlucky, it's 2.
It's a great place to arrive, though, isn't it? I guess for from your long commute. Where are the rocks in the Chinese garden imported from?
They're not imported; they're from Derbyshire. Well, they are imported, but not. Yeah, not. They're not Chinese rocks. That's a really interesting question, because when we went to China, we took some of our stone from proposed stone and held it against rocks at the autumn section of a garden in Yangzhou called the Gare Garden, and the geology is exactly the same. It was a total geological match, so that was very helpful.
Brilliant. And I've still got no correct answers for the rhododendron question, so you have to wait till the end for that one. On your wildflowers, which seed do you use?
I'd have to check which one we did in the end. Yeah, I can't remember. We've used about 6 or 7, but for the one I mentioned was for the orchard. It was a bee mix. I think it was 80% grasses, but I can't remember which without looking, and about 20% wildflower. So I can remember the ratios, but I can't remember what the composition was or the make without looking it up. Sorry.
No worries. Somebody's asking me about the Google Lens, so I'll show that again a little bit later if you want to hang around. And do you have to be an RHS member to pre-book? I'd probably say you wouldn't, would you? Because
I don't think so, because I think that would be quite too excluding. So I don't think so. No.
Not even just to manage numbers initially, because I'm guessing there's going to be a flood of people wanting to.
There might be a week or something where they have, like they have a members' day at Chelsea. There may be some limited periods where it's just for members, but I can't remember without double checking. But it could be quite short, that limited period, I think.
Sure. And in terms of the buildings that you've got in place there, I know you mentioned obviously the hexagonal community gardens are quite close, but has the COVID situation made you look at your buildings and have you had to change any of the format or layouts of them to create more space and perhaps take some shop floor retail space out of it?
I think they've looked at a number of different scenarios for the Welcome building, but it tends to be more in terms of visitor flow and how they manage people in and out of the space rather than reducing the space in the building. In terms of places like the Bee and Butterfly Garden, where we've got outdoor catering and tables and seats, there is a reduction. So we just go from 50 covers to 20 covers outside to make sure that people are suitably distanced from one another. So there is but we're still buying in the correct number of covers, seats and tables for a non-COVID situation, but we may be forced to just put out half our tables and chairs and then keep the other half back of house until we're allowed to do it, till we're allowed to get close than 2 meters. So there are complexities around that.
Yeah, sure. And I know obviously lots of gardens are having redundancies and reducing headcounts due to the COVID situation. Has that impacted any of the budget elements for Bridgewater, or have you been able to still do everything that you wanted to do?
We've been okay. We've been able to do everything that we wanted to do, I think. I think there was an understanding that if that was altered, those goalposts were moved on us at the last minute, it would be very, very difficult to achieve what we wanted to do. So there's been no increases, but we haven't been cut at the last minute.
Right. Sure. Okay.
I think there's such a tide of expectation. This is the 5th garden, it's the first one in 20 years. That I think to start making cuts at the end would have been counterproductive.
Yeah, sure.
They haven't, so it's been
and absolutely. I mean, you're investing for the future, aren't you? So
yeah.
And you mentioned Park Hall was the second choice. So if the RHS ever decide to build another garden, is it likely to come back to Stoke-on-Trent?
I think they'd go further now. I mean, I'm speculating. I think it may go a bit further afield because it's a long way from Manchester to Rosemoor to Harlow Carr. I mean, there's a bit of a gap in the middle, south of Birmingham somewhere, isn't there? I thought. Yeah, sure. And you mentioned vegetable trials. Obviously, looking to see which get the AGM award. And nutrition isn't part of that, is it? Because you're looking at pest diseases and where they grow well and where they work. Taste is,
yeah. Is there any chance that the RHS might look at nutrition as part of that? Because one of the things that we do in our garden club is we get out purple potatoes for people to grow because they're much higher in antioxidants.
Yeah.
And also we did purple carrots last year, actually. So is there anything, when you're looking at different varieties, to consider something like that as well? Which one's healthier for you?
Yeah, I mean, I can feed that back to Debbie Rowe, who's the trials officer at Bridgewater, and she works for me, and see what she says. I'll ask. I'll see.
Yeah.
I don't think it is, and then I can ask, well, why isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
I will do that. No problem.
Fantastic, brilliant. And Stephen's come back on that thing. Allegedly, the clock was made to strike 13 by the Canal Duke in 1789 because his workers would miss the single strike at the beginning of their lunch hour at 1 p.m.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'll have to listen out for that or ask.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the gardens, I know you said some of the designs that have evolved, like Tom Stewart Smith had created the initial design and things have changed over time. Is there any part of the garden which you think has got your particular stamp on it where people look at it and say, yeah, that was what Marcus's input was?
Quite a lot on the orchard. Yeah. So I'm down as the orchard designer, which specifically, yeah. There's some hot borders as well, which I didn't even mention, but I'm just keeping my powder dry. I've designed those as well, but I'm not quite sure how they're going to look this year. So I want to assess them and then maybe bang the drum about them or not for the following year. But there are some hot borders that I've designed as well.
Fantastic. If you could only have one shrub and one herbaceous perennial, which ones would you choose? I'm guessing that's a question for Marcus, not for me.
I would have, as a shrub,
one shrub and one herbaceous
only one.
perennial. Only one, yeah.
That's harsh. I mean, what do you go for? Do you go for something edible? Do you go for something? Okay, I'm just going to go for beauty. I'm just going to go for beauty. I would go for Chimonanthus praecox.
Okay, for the scent.
Yeah. And what's the other one I've got to go for? Herbaceous.
Herbaceous perennial. I suppose it might change which part of the season you're in, because that's probably why you picked Chimonanthus now.
Yeah, yeah. I will go for. Ooh, I do like a cone flower. I'm going to go for Echinacea purpurea magnus. I do like a cone flower. Yeah, there we go.
Fantastic, brilliant. And you mentioned some sort of private tours behind the scenes. So if our Tender Shoots Club ever decide to come and visit you, any chance we can get a tour with you around the unseen parts?
Maybe. I think that'd be popular.
You heard it here, folks. We've got it in writing. Brilliant. Well, I think, is that it, folks? Has anybody got any final questions? I think we're pretty much done. So thank you, Marcus. I think that's been an absolutely fantastic insight into the development of the gardens, the history and where you've got to so far. It's certainly whetted our appetite. I think we're all very keen and very eager to come and see it. So can I ask everybody to unmute yourselves, please? And can I ask you to all give Marcus a lovely round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy.
Brilliant. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye, 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 bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right then, folks.
Thank you.
Thank
It's very difficult. You've got to deal with council. You've got to deal with.
Okay, folks, the next date's actually tomorrow. So first question, so if you're planting a rhododendron, what soil conditions do you need?
Ericaceous. Are you looking for something more?
Yes, I am. You get half a point for that. You've obviously not been listening to my talks.
Micro.
It used to be ericaceous, but now you can actually get rhododendrons that have been grafted on a new lime-tolerant rootstock.
Yeah.
Billingham's white.
Yeah, but as the run-of-the-mill rhododendron.
So half a point for, it used to be right years ago, but now you can get rhododendrons for both types of soil conditions. So you need to look for, I haven't mentioned it a couple of times, so I'm not asking you questions that I haven't told you answers already. So you need to look for a rootstock called Incaro. That's what you need to look for. And the second question was, yes, so in one portion of your fruit and veg, how many grams does that equate to?
65.
100.
85.
12. 80.
12? 80.
80. I've got it.
Yeah.
So that means that it's supposed to be at least 5 portions. So you need to be eating almost half a kilo of fruit and veg a day.
That's an awful lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, well done for the ones who got that right. Okie dokie. Right. So,
Google
we'll
Lens.
open the breakout rooms in a moment, but for those who wants to leave now, I'll say goodbye and I'll see you tomorrow on Thursday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'm going in the breakout room. It won't be a lot of